My intent in the next 20 minutes or so is to see that if, by looking at some of the drivers for change in our national energy assets, we can infer something about how to recognise good solutions as and when they become available. When we ask ourselves what is the grid, a small distinction, most people tend to think of the bit on the left if they're inside of the industry, because that is the national grid as we used to understand it. But increasingly the term is used to describe the whole distribution network, not just the national high voltage grid, but also the local area grids. And we should also remember that there are a number of private network operators as well who are building from the bottom up rather than trying to work with an old asset and make decisions from the top down. So it's as well to bear that in mind. And its mission, they never said so, but at the top, the de facto, the implicit mission of the national grid was to provide anyone with as much energy as they wanted, physically, when they wanted it, at the drop of a hat. There were very few restrictions on what was allowed and what was disallowed, especially for medium and small consumers. If you look at the profiles on the left, this is national consumption divided by industrial at the bottom, commercial in the middle, and residential at the top. Industrial consumption has been controlled for quite a long time, and these guys have known that there's an interest in making sure that they use energy wisely. And if you want to build a plant that uses a lot of energy, one of your first considerations is, where is that going to come from? We used to build aluminium smelters next to hydropower stations. Now, as St. Simon very graphically pointed out, you build them in Iceland where the energy is cheaper already. Now, the middle band has also developed very rapidly. It's the upper band, the domestic group, that's described here in the index language, which is of more interest, because that's still quite volatile if you look at it on a quarterly profile, which is the one on the left. And there's also, of course, a diurnal profile that you see on the right. The big question is, can we imagine a giant control system with 30 million endpoints, if you think of electricity only, or possibly 50 million endpoints if you add in gas? Or are there other ways of doing this which would help us learn more about the content of the buzzword smart? Just something to note on the right. The mean electricity consumption based on Ofgem's last figures for unrestricted domestic consumers is 490 watts. So if we used energy at a constant rate, the average for each home in the country is less than 5 amps, just over 2 amps. The trouble is, we don't use the average all the time. It moves around, but it's as well to keep that in mind, because most of us have a 60, 80 or even 100 amp supply. Where are we now? This is our deck figures for our national energy consumption. You might think it doesn't look too scary. The top line does tend to go up slightly. The recession saved us a few megatons of carbon dioxide, but that we all hope will go away. The main issue is what happens just below the line that starts at 350 on the left-hand side. Most of our existing generation is due to be decommissioned soon, and the new stuff that looks like a lake coming ashore above is all new technology, renewables, things that have not been demonstrated on a large scale before. So although the growth in total consumption doesn't look wild, the growth in the things that we have to do is very significant indeed, and that represents a major new investment challenge or investment opportunity to deliver it. Now here's a slightly scary bit of plumbing. What's on the left-hand side, for the previous one incidentally, was what comes out of the system. We now have to consider what goes in. So on the left-hand side of that diagram are all the inputs to our national electricity supply system. The ones at the bottom left are things like coal and gas and oil. That's how much goes in. The thicker one in the middle upper middle is nuclear power, and then there are things like hydro, wind and so on, which if you read across to the right, they don't pass through the block in the middle, which is power stations. The scary drain at the bottom right is how much just disappears without trace. That's how much energy is lost in either in conversion or in transmission or distribution. And the answer is most of it is lost. Now that's obvious. When you burn coal, it's difficult to get more than 30% efficiency out of the station. But as coal burning becomes cleaner, that's going to get worse, not better, because we will use more energy to make it clean. Now this is one of the things that's drawing attention to alternative ways of burning things that must be burnt. CHP systems where you turn something on its head and say, don't make an energy generating engine that releases unwanted low-grade heat. Make a heater that releases some low-grade electricity, because that's much easier to move around. Think of CHP that way as a very, it's an efficient heater and an inefficient generator, but it doesn't matter because you can capture it then. So that leads towards recapturing some of these huge losses at the bottom, and is one of the reasons for attracting so much interest in technology like CHP, which in its basic form has been around for quite a long time. But there's a massive driver now to say we need to take that more seriously. But it also works better on a neighbourhood scale. Heat doesn't travel that well, and it starts to break down the concept of one huge national grid into something much more devolved. And perhaps there's a clue to the content of the word smart within that. Now on the right hand side, there's what actually comes out and what we use for transport, domestic, other consumers and so on. I've drawn a boomerang there on transport because they too have an emissions problem. And one of the things we would like to do is introduce more electrification into our transport system, because once you've got electricity, using it is very efficient. And this is sparking a debate about electric vehicles and other forms of electrifying the public transport network. The trouble is that probably places a bigger burden on generation, so it might actually make the generation problem worse. And just one plug finally for clean coal. It's often argued, I've heard people say, well, it doesn't solve all our problems, we've still got problems even with clean coal. That's true, but we cannot, I would suggest, solve all our problems without it. So it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for creating the clean generation portfolio that we need in future. Now, none of these problems is new. So you might think, well, why are we here now? Why is it only now that government have already started to earmark quite large sums of money coming from our residential electricity and gas bills towards solutions in this area? And I would suggest that actually, as is often the case, it's not one thing, but it's a combination of factors which has made it now possible to promote energy awareness and energy saving as a vote winner rather than a vote loser, even although it means that our bills are going to go up, not down as a result. The argument is they're going to go up less than they would do if we did nothing about it. So I'd just like to pick these off one at a time. The good news about this next bit is you only have to be 5 years old to understand it, not because of the mental age you need, but that the real history can all be picked up from events that happened round about 2005. The then consumer group, Energy Watch, was given powers in 2004 to bring complaints to the Office of Fair Trading, even if it had not had a complaint from a consumer. And they exercised that right in 2005 and brought what was known as the super complaint to the regulator, actually, in their role as an agent of the OFT, to say that customer service in this country wasn't good enough. And in particular, our bills were not sufficiently accurate. They were guessed, and they weren't guessed well enough. And that was the #1 source of complaint for consumers when asked what they were dissatisfied with in the energy supply industry. It was inaccurate billing was their main complaint. Now, the reaction of the energy industry was, well, we can improve data, but only at a price. If we want to have every energy bill based on an exact calculation on real data, we would have to install some kind of communications and better recording equipment. And although the bills will be better, your total price is going to go up when we do get it right as a result. So the driver was there, but it was insufficient on its own to create a move to even the earlier forms of smart metering then. And we had this debate about automatic meter reading and so on, which I think many of you will be familiar with. However, by coincidence, also in 2005, we had a very cold spell in the autumn. This is a map of the gas pipes that were up and running then or thenabouts in the middle of Europe. And there's a lot more of them than most people realise. The way this is supposed to work is that by a network of contracts, if gas prices are high in one place and low in another place, gas should flow through the pipes to such an extent that it balances the price, and we have a European market for gas. And the UK was heavily reliant, particularly British Gas themselves, on contractual arrangements to solve any gas shortages. And a lot of these contracts read through to agreements that started right on the right-hand side of that diagram. Now, between October and November 2005, our gas prices went up times 5. Now, not just 5% or 10%, they went up times 500% increase. And that sent a shockwave through the industry, especially if you think of the plumbing diagram, that so much of our electricity is generated from gas as well. So electricity went up 2.5 times, from 4 pence to 10 pence. And this did not attract enough gas coming through from the European networks to the UK to allow the price to go down again. For two reasons: the Russians and the Ukrainians were in dispute. The Ukrainians netted out what they wanted, and the Russians only sent what they felt the Western Europeans had paid for, so gas didn't flow. But also, those who had storage had hedged their storage prices at what they thought the winter price would be. And this wasn't winter, this was September, October, so they couldn't afford to put their gas back into the system. Net result is we nearly ran short, and if we hadn't had help from Scandinavia, we would have done so. So that sent a second scare through the industry. So we need a much better energy budget than we have. We need to know what goes in and what comes out. We need to plan more carefully to make sure that if we just put price on one side, that we do actually get electricity and gas when we turn our switches and gas taps on. Now, by coincidence, a third thing, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, Gordon Brown, commissioned Nicholas Stern to do some analysis on lots of the stories that were going about the effects of carbon dioxide on world climate. And cutting a long story short, we got a very powerful report back from Nicholas Stern saying this is a big problem. The only good news about it is the sooner you act, the less it costs you. Bad news is it's going to cost you a lot, but the good news is get your skates on and it costs you a bit less, heavily paraphrasing. Now, people were sceptical about whether government would move. They promised energy acts and so on. They did. They've delivered 2. There was more or less all-party support for the fundamentals of these acts, and these have continued even after this election. We can expect another energy act either later this year or early next year. And these give the Department of Energy the power, the instruments to implement government policy. They've got to do more than just say, we want you all to lose less energy. They have to have teeth that enable them to exert that policy and to do something about it if it's not happening. And the fourth thing is, we discovered that we're not alone. There's a torrent of legislation, new directives, coming from people thinking along the same lines as ourselves in our European neighbouring countries. In particular, I would pick out one right in the middle, the Directive on Energy End-Use Efficiency. But this obliged countries to make commitments, not just to offer policy statements, but to make commitments on reducing energy consumption as a whole, and on doing something about carbon emissions. And if we look at one of our closer neighbours, who we'll be seeing even more closely at the weekend, I think, they're thinking about what effect this has on their market as a whole. They are not assuming that everyone comes out of this with the same role as they went in, but with more or less business. They're saying, well, this changes the shape of the energy industry. Is an energy supplier the right party to be helping us save energy consumption? How can we get consumers to engage in the process? Because unless they care, unless they take local action based on high quality information, we can't get this distributed smart reaction. The only alternative is load control. That's a sort of more vicious end of demand response. Or if you want to put it really brutally, energy rationing. And that's a vote loser. So they're really strongly looking at ways of trying to reinterpret the market, roll changes for everyone involved to see how they can get this to work. Now, throughout this, the Department of Energy's policy has not changed hugely. So the good news is it's steady. Perhaps the bad news is we would like to see more detail appearing perhaps faster than it has, but they face a tough challenge in figuring out how to exert the policies that they have been developing. But they have squirreled away some money, so buried in our bills, there's about, depending on what you count, between 50 and 80 pounds of every one of our electricity and gas annual bills is already earmarked for reinvestment in environmental programs. So the utilities themselves are obliged to charge us that money, and then they use it to fund projects which are passed or rejected by the Department of Energy. And there's a statement from Ofgem, I'm not sure if you can see that, but there's 24, 45, 12, there's about 80 odd pounds worth of money in our electricity and gas bills, which has got nothing to do with today's cost of electricity and gas, and has everything to do with trying to encourage the industry to produce it in the right way for us, to do things that they would not otherwise have done if their only driver was how do you make as much money as you can in the next few years. Finally, the boomerang that we threw earlier on, the electric vehicle business, there's a startling coincidence here that at this stage I think it's only a coincidence, but it's of such significance I find it hard to ignore. The amount of energy required by a car to get from here to London and back is about 12 kilowatt hours. It doesn't matter what the engine, the converter in the car is. That's what you need to drive half a tonne through the air to London and back in a day. You need about 12 kilowatt hours to do that. And 12 kilowatt hours happens to be almost exactly the mean daily consumption of a house. So if you're a pessimist, you say all these electric vehicles, they're going to make the problem even worse. We've already got a volatile profile, and now we're going to add on something that's not just another 5% or 10% on the top, it doubles it. And what's more, it's probably likely to happen at a time of day that's inconvenient. You know, before we all go to work in the morning, we want to make sure our cars are charged, that kind of thing. But if you're an optimist, you might think, well, these industries are surely converging. We don't know what it is from the utilities industry that these guys are putting in their cars, the batteries, but whatever they are, if you can power a car for a day, you can power a house for a day. The same thing. And then you don't have to worry about the profile. You could all present an absolutely flat profile to the system. In fact, you don't need a 12 kilowatt hour battery to do that. On average, you only need about a 2.5 kilowatt hour battery to do that. Now, there's lots of downside. They cost a fortune. They don't last very long. The recharge rate is difficult. But there is investment in hundreds and hundreds of millions of pounds from colliding industries to find better and better ways of doing that. So having asked myself the question at the start, I feel an obligation at least to offer you some sort of answer. And I think some of the key aspects of the smart world is that we're looking for something that allows us all to participate in the adoption of new technologies. And without this participation, I don't think we get the local action that enables a smart grid to become really smart. We have a control system today that's bigger tomorrow, and perhaps misses some of the opportunities that we've got to reach out into neighbouring fields and see what things can help us. Now, I trust that over the next couple of days we'll pick up all kinds of things within the smart grid concept that we can learn more about. I'll just pick out a couple of areas here. There's the virtual world at the bottom left-hand side, which is very effective in terms of calculations. One way of storing energy is to freeze something colder than you would otherwise have frozen it. And then you don't need the energy when it's expensive because it heats up to a level that was still below where you wanted it to be. It's an odd way of storing energy to store anti-energy, but it looks like a store. Loads that can be switched off suddenly look like a source of energy if you can offer the switching off facility to someone else. I just ring an alarm bell there though and say it's a bit like the banking system. There's a difference between a chest with a bunch of gold coins in it and a chest with a bunch of IOUs in it. Even if the first IOU is highly reliable, if that leads to another and another and another and another, there's a danger of building a system that is unstable or that doesn't work under high stress situations. At the top right, local storage and network storage, we believe is part of the solution, that finding novel ways of doing that are important. But the one I would really pick out is in the middle on the left-hand side, is the customer behaviour side. Unless we get the engagement of ordinary consumers, we won't deliver a smart anything. We all have to care more about where our energy comes from and where it goes. I put a timeline along the bottom because much of this is all about communications and getting the right communications mechanisms in place that make all of these things possible. I'll skip to the end because I'm conscious of the time. A challenge I often give people, this is a sort of a summary of various things that might appear in our cityscapes in future. The challenge is, will Scunthorpe ever look like this? And when you ask the question that week, and that's just not going to happen, is it? You know, I go to Scunthorpe before you, and I hope there's no one from Scunthorpe here. That's just horribly rude to. But you know, you think it's a real stark challenge. But my answer is, it is going to have to look like this on the inside, even if it doesn't look like this on the outside. It's got to happen, or we won't get our energy consumption under control. Thank you very much.